It started with the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop. A deafening crash at the front door, followed by muffled voices barking orders like a poorly rehearsed SWAT raid. Richard bolted upright on his couch, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. For a split second, he thought he was back in combat, reliving one of those chaotic nights overseas. But no, this wasn't enemy territory. This was his living room, and the attackers weren't armed insurgents. They were his HOA's so-called security patrol, led by Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of suburban tyranny. Through his security cameras, Richard saw them. Karen and her entourage of clipboard-wielding henchmen, standing on his porch like they were about to stage an intervention. One guy had a crowbar. Richard blinked twice, wondering if he'd accidentally wandered into a bad sitcom or if this was actually happening. The door shook violently as Karen shouted, "Open up! Richard, this is an official HOA inspection." Official? Since when did HOA inspections involve breaking and entering? And why did Karen look like she was auditioning for a low-budget crime drama? Richard froze for a moment, trying to process the absurdity unfolding before him. He grabbed his phone and checked the security feed again. There they were, Karen in her signature power stance, flanked by three men who looked less like security professionals and more like dads who'd gotten lost on their way to Home Depot. They were dressed identically in khaki pants and polo shirts, carrying flashlights and clipboards as though suburban espionage was their full-time gig. Richard muttered under his breath, "What fresh hell is this?" He watched as Karen barked orders at her minions like she was leading a tactical operation. One of them jabbed the crowbar into the doorframe with all the finesse of someone who'd never seen an action movie. For a moment, Richard wondered if this was some bizarre HOA ritual he hadn't been briefed on. A neighborhood hazing where they break into your house to check if your curtains match the approved color palette. The banging continued, each thud louder than the last. Richard's military instincts kicked in. He wasn't just any homeowner. He was a former Navy SEAL turned SWAT trainer who'd spent years teaching people how to handle situations exactly like this. Minus the HOA nonsense. If Karen thought she could intimidate him with her clipboard-wielding henchmen, she had another thing coming. But first, Richard needed to understand what lunacy had led to this moment. He pulled up the HOA's bylaws on his tablet, a document thicker than War and Peace but far less coherent. Somewhere between rules about acceptable mailbox designs and fines for parking your car facing east instead of west, he found it. Section 14.3b. The HOA reserves the right to conduct security inspections if suspicious activity is reported. Suspicious activity? The only suspicious thing happening here was Karen's haircut, which looked like it had been styled with a weed whacker. Richard sighed deeply and dialed 911. Not because he needed help, but because he wanted witnesses for what was about to go down. As he waited for the operator to pick up, Karen's voice echoed through the door. "Richard, we know you're in there. Open up or we'll call the cops." The irony wasn't lost on him. Karen threatening to call law enforcement while actively committing breaking and entering was peak HOA logic. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm voice on the other end. "Yes, hi," Richard replied, trying to suppress laughter. "I'm currently being raided by my HOA." There was a pause. "Your HOA?" "Correct," Richard said. "They've got flashlights and clipboards, and one guy has a crowbar." Another pause. "Sir, are you sure this isn't a prank?" "Oh, I wish," Richard said dryly. The operator assured him that officers were on their way and hung up. Meanwhile, Karen's crew had managed to pry open one of Richard's windows, a feat that would have been impressive if it weren't so blatantly illegal. He decided it was time to intervene. Richard opened the front door abruptly, causing Karen and her minions to jump back in surprise. He stood there in his SWAT training gear, black tactical pants and a shirt emblazoned with SWAT instructor. His imposing figure combined with his unimpressed glare made Karen falter for a moment before regaining her usual bravado. "Ah, Richard," she said with faux sweetness that could curdle milk. "We were just conducting a routine security check." "A routine security check?" Richard repeated incredulously. "With a crowbar?" Karen waved dismissively as though breaking into someone's home was standard procedure for suburban governance. We received reports of suspicious activity at your property. Richard raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? Like what? Karen hesitated before blurting out. Your grass is 2 inches taller than HOA regulations allow. Richard stared at her for a long moment before bursting into laughter. A deep belly laugh that echoed down the street. Karen looked offended but pressed on. Unkempt lawns can attract pests, she said defensively. Karen, Richard said between chuckles. I train SWAT teams for a living. Do you really think I'm worried about pests? Her face turned redder than a stop sign as she scrambled for another excuse. We also noticed, unauthorized modifications to your mailbox. Richard glanced at his mailbox. A perfectly ordinary black box with no signs of rebellion against HOA standards, and shook his head in disbelief. Before Karen could invent more crimes against suburban decorum, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. 2 police cars pulled up in front of Richard's house, their officers stepping out with looks that screamed, "What now?" Karen immediately switched tactics, adopting an air of innocence that would have been convincing if not for the crowbar still clutched by one of her minions. "Officers," she exclaimed dramatically. "Thank goodness you're here. We were just trying to ensure community safety." One officer turned to Richard and asked calmly, "Sir, can you explain what's going on?" Richard gestured toward Karen and her crew like they were contestants on America's Most Ridiculous Criminals. "These fine folks decided my lawn height constituted suspicious activity and broke into my house." The officer raised an eyebrow at Karen, who stammered incoherently before pointing at her clipboard as though it held all the answers to life's mysteries. The second officer inspected the window they'd pried open and shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am," he said sternly to Karen, "this is breaking and entering." Karen sputtered indignantly but couldn't form coherent words under their scrutiny. As Karen tried, and failed, to talk her way out of trouble, Richard leaned against his doorframe with a satisfied smirk. His peaceful evening had been interrupted by absurdity worthy of reality TV, but watching Karen squirm under police questioning almost made it worth it. In that moment, Richard realized something profound. HOAs might think they rule suburbia with an iron fist, but even they aren't above the law or common sense. So, after the cops left, Karen didn't waste any time regrouping her little HOA army. You'd think getting caught trying to pry open someone's window with a crowbar would make a person rethink their life choices, but not Karen. Oh no, she doubled down. That's the thing about people like her. They don't see themselves as the problem. To Karen, she wasn't a suburban tyrant who had just committed a felony. She was a hero, valiantly protecting the neighborhood from tall grass and slightly non-compliant mailboxes. The very next day, Richard received an official-looking letter in his mailbox. It was on HOA letterhead, complete with their ridiculous motto, "Preserving harmony, one rule at a time." Inside was a formal notice of violation. According to Karen and her merry band of clipboard warriors, Richard was guilty of no fewer than 7 infractions. 7. The list read like it had been written by someone who had way too much time on their hands and a personal vendetta against happiness. Violation 1. Lawn exceeds maximum allowable height by 2 inches. Violation 2. Unauthorized flagpole placement. Violation 3. Mailbox does not meet aesthetic standards. Violation 4. Trash bins visible from the street. Violation 5. Unapproved exterior lighting fixture. Violation 6. Failure to attend mandatory HOA meetings. And my personal favorite, Violation 7. General noncompliance with community spirit. Richard stared at the letter in disbelief. General noncompliance with community spirit? What did that even mean? Was he supposed to host block parties and bake cookies for the entire neighborhood? And the flagpole? He didn't even have a flagpole. The only pole on his property was the one holding up his basketball hoop, a hoop that had been there since before he moved in. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. Along with the list of violations came an invoice for fines totaling $1,500. $1,500. For what? Having grass that dared to grow? Richard couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. He settled on laughing because, honestly, What else could you do when faced with this level of absurdity? Now, Richard wasn't the kind of guy to let things slide, especially not when they involved someone trying to extort him over imaginary flagpoles. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He started digging. Not literally, Karen would probably fine him for that, but figuratively. He pulled out every document he had on the HOA, from the original agreement he'd signed when he moved in to the latest updates to their bylaws. And let me tell you, those bylaws were a goldmine of contradictions and loopholes. For example, one section stated that all homes must have uniformly painted shutters, but another section said shutters were optional. There were rules about acceptable driveway materials, approved holiday decorations, no inflatables allowed, and even a clause banning excessively loud wind chimes. Who writes this stuff? Was there some secret HOA council meeting where they sat around debating the moral implications of wind chime volume? Richard also discovered something interesting. Karen's term as HOA president was technically supposed to have ended 6 months ago, but instead of holding an election for new leadership, she'd simply declared herself acting president until further notice. Classic Karen. Armed with this information, Richard decided it was time to fight back. Not just for himself, but for every poor soul in the neighborhood who'd ever been fined for leaving their trash bins out an hour too long or parking their car slightly over the line. He started by talking to his neighbors. Now, here's the thing about HOAs. Most people hate them but are too scared or apathetic to do anything about it. But once Richard started sharing his story, complete with security footage of Karen's crowbar antics, his neighbors began opening up about their own experiences. There was Susan down the street who'd been fined $200 because her garden gnome didn't meet community aesthetic standards. And Bob next door who'd been forced to repaint his house because Karen decided beige was no longer an approved color. The more stories Richard heard, the angrier he got. Not just at Karen, but at the whole system that allowed someone like her to wield so much power over other people's lives. It wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes, it was about control. Karen wasn't preserving harmony. She was micromanaging happiness out of existence. So Richard hatched a plan that would make use of his skills as a SWAT trainer and his newfound knowledge of HOA bylaws. Step 1. Gather evidence. He set up additional security cameras around his property and began documenting everything. Every letter from Karen, every interaction with her patrol squad, every ridiculous fine she tried to impose. Step 2. Expose Karen's hypocrisy. Remember that clause about mandatory elections? Richard found out that several neighbors had tried to run against Karen in previous years, but were mysteriously disqualified for failing to meet eligibility requirements. One of those neighbors was Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and had never once violated an HOA rule, until Karen decided his bird feeder was a potential safety hazard. Step 3. Rally support. Richard started hosting informal meetings at his house. Not HOA meetings, because those required approval from Karen, but gatherings where neighbors could vent their frustrations and brainstorm solutions. Word spread quickly, and soon half the neighborhood was showing up at Richard's door with stories of their own run-ins with Karen. And step 4, the piece de resistance. Take legal action. Richard consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and learned that many of Karen's actions weren't just unethical, they were flat-out illegal. From falsifying election results to imposing fines without proper documentation, Karen had violated more rules than she'd enforced. But before taking her down legally, Richard wanted one last showdown. A chance to confront her directly and show her just how much power she didn't have anymore. So when Karen called yet another emergency HOA meeting to discuss ongoing security concerns, Richard showed up armed, not with weapons, though he could have easily brought those, but with evidence. He brought copies of bylaws, testimonies from neighbors, and even photos of Karen's own violations, like her unapproved backyard gazebo and her dog's habit of digging up other people's flower beds. When it came time for public comments, Richard stood up and calmly laid out his case against her. Point by point, violation by violation. By the time he finished speaking, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Karen tried to defend herself, of course she did, but it was no use. The neighbors were fed up, and they made it clear they weren't going to tolerate her nonsense any longer. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been passed to hold new elections immediately, And guess who wasn't eligible to run this time? That's right, Queen Karen herself. As Richard walked out of that meeting surrounded by cheering neighbors, he couldn't help but smile. The battle wasn't over yet. There were still legal proceedings ahead. But for now, victory tasted sweet. And as for those $1,500 in fines, let's just say they were promptly rescinded, along with every other ridiculous penalty Karen had ever imposed on him or anyone else in the neighborhood. After the HOA meeting where Karen's reign of terror began to crumble, you'd think she might take the hint and quietly fade into the background. Maybe take up knitting or move to a remote cabin where she could boss around squirrels instead of humans. But no, Karen wasn't just doubling down. She was going full scorched earth. The very next morning, Richard woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It was another violation letter from the HOA, but this time it wasn't signed by Karen. Oh no, she'd apparently deputized one of her loyal minions, Greg, to do her dirty work. Greg was one of those guys who peaked in high school and still wore his varsity jacket to neighborhood barbecues. His official title was assistant to the HOA president, which sounded like something he made up just so he could feel important. The letter accused Richard of creating a hostile environment within the community and warned that further actions could result in legal consequences. Legal consequences. Richard couldn't help but laugh as he read it over his morning coffee. The only hostile environment in this neighborhood was Karen's personality, but Karen wasn't done yet. By noon, Richard noticed a new addition to his front yard. A tiny surveillance camera mounted on a pole near the sidewalk. It was pointed directly at his house, blinking red like some kind of suburban Big Brother experiment. He checked with his neighbors and found out that Karen had installed cameras all over the neighborhood to ensure compliance with HOA standards. Compliance. As if she were running some dystopian HOA dictatorship where everyone had to salute her mailbox before leaving for work. Richard decided it was time to escalate things. Strategically, of course. He wasn't about to let Karen and her little army of clipboard warriors intimidate him or anyone else in the neighborhood. So, he started by doing what any rational person would do. He threw an epic backyard barbecue. Now, this wasn't just any barbecue. This was a full-blown neighborhood event complete with a bounce house for the kids, a live band playing classic rock covers, and enough grilled meat to feed an army. Richard even rented a snow cone machine because why not? The goal was simple. Bring the neighbors together and remind them that life in this community didn't have to revolve around Karen's ridiculous rules. And let me tell you, people showed up in droves. Susan brought her infamous potato salad, the one Karen had once called too garlicky, at a potluck. Bob brought a cooler full of beer and set up a cornhole game in the driveway. Even Mr. Thompson, the guy who'd been disqualified from running against Karen because of his bird feeder, showed up with his grandkids in tow. Of course, Karen wasn't invited, but that didn't stop her from making an appearance anyway. About halfway through the party, she stormed into Richard's backyard like she was leading an HOA SWAT team raid. "This is a violation of HOA regulations," she screeched, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of magical scepter. Richard calmly turned down the music and addressed her with the kind of patience usually reserved for toddlers throwing tantrums. "Karen," he said, "it's a barbecue, not an underground fight club." But Karen wasn't having it. She pointed at the bounce house and declared it an unapproved structure. Then she moved on to the band, accusing them of violating noise ordinances, even though they were playing at a reasonable volume and it wasn't even past 7 p.m. The neighbors weren't having it either. Susan stepped forward and said, "Karen, for once in your life, can you just let people enjoy themselves?" Bob chimed in with, "Yeah, maybe if you had some potato salad once in a while, you wouldn't be so uptight." Karen looked like she was about to explode when Greg, the aforementioned assistant to the HOA president, showed up with his own clipboard and tried to back her up. But Greg wasn't exactly intimidating. He tripped over the garden hose on his way into the yard and spilled iced tea all over himself. At this point, Richard decided enough was enough. He pulled out his phone and started recording as Karen ranted about bylaws and unapproved activities. "Karen," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you're trespassing on private property right now, and I'm pretty sure that violates more than one law." That shut her up for about 5 seconds. Then she declared that she'd be issuing fines to everyone who attended the party before storming off with Greg trailing behind her like a lost puppy. The party continued without incident after that, but Richard knew this wasn't over. Karen might have been humiliated in front of half the neighborhood, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Sure enough, 2 days later Richard received another letter, this time from an actual lawyer representing the HOA. The letter accused him of defamation because apparently filming Karen's meltdown counted as slander, and demanded that he take down any videos or social media posts related to the incident. Richard couldn't help but laugh as he read it aloud to Susan and Bob over coffee that morning. Defamation? Susan said incredulously. She defamed herself by acting like a lunatic. Bob added, if anything, you should be suing her for emotional distress after having to deal with this nonsense. But Richard had no intention of backing down. Not now, not ever. He forwarded the letter to his own lawyer, the same one who'd been helping him dig into Karen's questionable leadership practices, and prepared for what he knew would be another battle. In the meantime, he decided to have some fun with those surveillance cameras Karen had installed around the neighborhood. Using his SWAT training expertise and a little help from Bob's teenage son who was great with tech, Richard set up harmless but hilarious pranks designed specifically for Karen's cameras. One night, they staged an elaborate scene where Bob dressed up as Bigfoot and wandered through Richard's yard holding a garden gnome like it was treasure. Another time, they set up inflatable flamingos all over Susan's lawn with tiny signs that read, "Approved by HOA Wildlife Division." And my personal favorite? The time they built a fake UFO out of cardboard boxes and filmed themselves pretending to communicate with aliens under one of Karen's cameras. The neighbors loved it, and so did most people online when Richard started sharing clips on social media, with all identifying details blurred out for legal reasons. The videos went viral almost overnight, turning Karen into an unwitting internet celebrity known as HOA Karen. And while all this was happening, Richard kept gathering evidence against her. Every ridiculous fine she issued, every petty rule she tried to enforce, all meticulously documented and ready for whatever came next. Because if there's one thing Richard knew for sure by now, it was this: you don't mess with someone who trains SWAT teams for fun. Especially when they've got nothing left to lose but their patience with your nonsense. Richard knew the showdown was inevitable. Karen wasn't just a problem. She was the problem. The kind of person who could turn a peaceful suburban neighborhood into a battleground of passive-aggressive emails, pointless fines, and clipboard tyranny. And now, with her surveillance cameras, her petty legal threats, and her increasingly unhinged behavior, she'd gone too far. But Richard wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to end this nonsense once and for all. The opportunity came when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda? Addressing community disruptions and security concerns. Translation: Karen wanted to yell at Richard in front of everyone and try to reassert her crumbling authority. She scheduled it for Saturday morning at the community clubhouse, a place that, ironically, had been built using HOA funds that Karen had reallocated without a vote. Richard knew this meeting wasn't just about him. It was about Karen trying to salvage what little power she had left. Richard spent the week preparing. He wasn't just going to show up, he was going to show out. He printed copies of every ridiculous fine Karen had issued him, every letter she'd sent, and every bylaw she'd violated herself. He compiled testimonies from neighbors who'd been harassed by her over the years, complete with photos and timestamps. And, of course, he brought along the piece de resistance: video footage from his security cameras of Karen's infamous crowbar raid on his house. When Saturday morning rolled around, Richard arrived at the clubhouse early. He wasn't alone, half the neighborhood showed up too. Word had spread about the meeting, and people were eager to see what would happen. Some came out of curiosity, others out of solidarity with Richard, and a few just wanted to watch Karen implode in real time. Karen strutted into the room like she owned it, clipboard in hand and Greg trailing behind her like an obedient golden retriever. She immediately launched into her usual spiel about preserving community standards and ensuring safety for all residents. It was classic Karen, long-winded, self-righteous, and completely detached from reality. But then Richard raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "Before we go any further, I think it's important that we address some inconsistencies in your leadership. Karen froze mid-sentence. Inconsistencies? She repeated, her voice dripping with faux innocence. Yes, Richard replied. For example, how you've been acting as HOA president for 6 months past your term limit without holding an election. The room went silent. Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. Well, she stammered, there were no eligible candidates. That's not true, Richard interrupted. Mr. Thompson tried to run against you last year, but you disqualified him because of his bird feeder. Karen opened her mouth to respond but couldn't seem to find the words. Richard pressed on. And then there's the matter of financial transparency, he continued. According to HOA bylaws, all major expenditures need to be approved by a community vote. But somehow you managed to spend $10,000 on those surveillance cameras without consulting anyone. Karen tried to regain control of the room. Those cameras are for everyone's safety, she snapped. Really? Richard said with a smirk. Because they seem more like your personal spy network. At this point, Susan chimed in from the back of the room. Yeah, and why is there a camera pointed directly at my backyard? Are you monitoring my garden gnomes for suspicious activity? The room erupted in laughter. Even Greg looked like he was trying not to smile. Karen slammed her clipboard down on the table. This is ridiculous, she shouted. I'm doing what's best for this community. Richard raised an eyebrow. Breaking into my house with a crowbar was what's best for this community? And with that, he pulled out his laptop and played the footage for everyone to see. Karen and her so-called security patrol attempting their amateur hour raid on his property while shouting about tall grass and mailbox violations. The room went dead silent as the video played. When it ended, someone in the back muttered, "Oh my God!" Another person whispered, Is that Greg holding a crowbar?" Greg turned bright red and sank into his chair. Karen looked like she might spontaneously combust from sheer embarrassment. But before she could say anything, Richard pulled out another piece of evidence. A copy of the lawyer's letter accusing him of defamation. "Let's talk about this," he said, holding up the letter for everyone to see. "Karen tried to sue me for defamation because I recorded her breaking into my house, which is not only absurd but also illegal." At this point, Bob stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. "Karen, you've lost your damn mind." The room erupted into applause. Karen tried one last desperate move. She stood up and declared that anyone who sided with Richard would be fined for violating HOA rules. But by now, no one was listening to her anymore. Not even Greg. Richard seized the moment. He motioned toward Mr. Thompson and said, "I propose we hold an immediate vote for new HOA leadership." The room cheered in agreement. Karen protested loudly, something about needing proper notice or following procedure, but no one cared anymore. The neighbors were done with her nonsense. The vote was unanimous. Mr. Thompson was elected as the new HOA president on the spot. His first act? Repealing all of Karen's ridiculous fines and dismantling her surveillance camera network. As Karen stormed out of the clubhouse in defeat, someone shouted after her, "Don't forget your crowbar." Richard couldn't help but smile as he watched her leave. The battle had been long and ridiculous, but justice had finally prevailed. And as for Richard, well, he went home that day knowing he'd done more than just stand up for himself. He'd stood up for an entire neighborhood tired of living under Karen's iron-fisted rule. Sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's absolutely hilarious. With Karen dethroned and Mr. Thompson now at the helm of the HOA, you'd think the story would end there. The evil queen banished, the villagers rejoicing. Cue the credits, right? But no, Richard wasn't done yet. Because while Karen may have been stripped of her clipboard and her self-appointed crown, there was still one loose end to tie up: accountability. And Richard wasn't about to let her slink away without facing the consequences of her crowbar-wielding suburban dictatorship. The first order of business? Those surveillance cameras. Mr. Thompson wasted no time dismantling Karen's Orwellian network. Within 24 hours of his election, he'd hired a local handyman to take them down, one by one. And because karma has a sense of humor, It turned out Karen had installed one of the cameras on Susan's property without permission. Susan, being Susan, decided to keep it as a souvenir. She mounted it on her garden gnome and named it Karen Cam. It became a neighborhood attraction. But Richard had bigger plans. He wasn't just satisfied with taking down Karen's cameras or erasing her ridiculous fines. He wanted to make sure she could never pull this kind of stunt again. So he filed a formal complaint with the county government, outlining all of Karen's abuses of power, the unauthorized expenditures, the illegal fines, and, of course, the attempted break-in at his house. He attached every piece of evidence he'd collected: videos, letters, testimonies from neighbors, and sent it off with a note that read, "For your entertainment." A few weeks later, Richard got a call from a very amused county official who assured him that Karen's actions were being investigated. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had complained about her. She'd been on their radar for years but had always managed to wriggle out of trouble, until now. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood started to improve almost immediately. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, people began to relax. Bob finally repainted his house a color he actually liked, a cheerful blue instead of HOA-approved beige. Susan threw a garden party with an inflatable flamingo theme just to spite Karen's old "no inflatables" rule. Even Mr. Thompson seemed happier. He installed a new bird feeder in his yard and invited everyone over for tea to celebrate. As for Richard, he decided to use his newfound free time to give back to the community in his own way. Remember how he trains SWAT teams for a living? Well, he thought it might be fun to share some of those skills with his neighbors. Not because they needed tactical training, although after dealing with Karen, who knows? But because it was a great way to bring people together. So one Saturday morning, Richard set up an obstacle course in his backyard and invited everyone over for what he called suburban SWAT training. It was part self-defense class, part team-building exercise, and 100% hilarious. Bob showed up in full camo gear like he was auditioning for the Expendables. Susan brought homemade cookies shaped like grenades. Even Mr. Thompson participated, though he mostly cheered from the sidelines while holding his bird-watching binoculars. Richard taught them how to clear rooms, aka their garages, how to handle hostile threats, aka overly aggressive door-to-door salesmen, and how to use everyday items as improvised tools. Turns out garden hoses make excellent tripwires. The highlight of the day was when Greg, yes, Greg, showed up unannounced and asked if he could join in. Now, Greg had been laying low since the HOA coup but seemed genuinely remorseful about his role as Karen's lackey. Richard decided to give him a chance. And you know what? Greg turned out to be surprisingly good at suburban SWAT training. Probably because he'd spent so much time carrying clipboards and sneaking around other people's yards. By the end of the day, everyone was laughing and high-fiving like they'd just won American Ninja Warrior. It was exactly what the neighborhood needed. A chance to heal and move forward together. But Karen? Oh no, she wasn't moving forward or anywhere else for that matter. A few months after she lost her position as HOA president, Richard got another call from that same county official. Turns out Karen had been fined for misappropriating HOA funds and was being investigated for tax fraud related to some shady bookkeeping practices during her reign of terror. Richard couldn't help but laugh when he heard the news. "I guess she finally got fined for something real," he said. "And just when you thought things couldn't get any better, they did." The video Richard had posted online, the one showing Karen's crowbar raid on his house, had gone viral again after someone turned it into a parody music video set to Bad Reputation by Joan Jett. It racked up millions of views on TikTok and YouTube, turning Karen into an internet meme overnight. People started calling her Crowbar Karen and making jokes about her running for president of the United States on a platform of mandatory beige houses and clipboard inspections. Someone even made t-shirts that said, "I survived Crowbar Karen," with a picture of her infamous clipboard on them. Karen eventually moved out of the neighborhood. Not because anyone forced her to, but because she couldn't handle being recognized everywhere she went. Rumor has it she relocated to another state and joined a new HOA under an assumed name. But honestly, that's someone else's problem now. As for Richard, he became something of a local legend, a suburban folk hero who stood up to tyranny with nothing but common sense and a sense of humor. People still stop him at the grocery store or wave at him from their cars just to say thanks for what he did. And every once in a while, when Richard walks past Susan's yard and sees Karen Cam perched on top of that garden gnome, he can't help but smile. So what's the moral of this story? Simple. Don't mess with someone who trains SWAT teams for fun, and definitely don't bring a clipboard to a crowbar fight. If you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed telling it, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, leave me a comment below about your own HOA horror stories, and hey, hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Thanks for watching.